party dancer, MC, entrepreneur, educationist. She wears many hats with great ease. May I request both of you to commence the session?
Now, firstly, as we begin, other than those who are meant to be seated on the chairs with the arms to have the correct kingly posture, all others, I request you to come forward. We'll have this as an interactive session because the one thing I said to Prasenjit was he should have been a teacher. And the difficulty with all of us who went to schools and colleges and were bored in rooms with too much knowledge and too little assimilation of the same, it is because the person teaching doesn't have the same passion as someone like Prasenjit. So please come forward, make this as intimate as possible. This book, India Reborn, touches upon one of the greats of all times. That's Krishna Deva Raya. And I would like to say it's a privilege to be at the Bhopal Literature Festival. And the man who is behind this festival reminds me of this Krishna Deva Raya. Do you know why? He was not a king to be in luxury. He was a king to serve the people. So Mr. Raghav Chandra has served as a bureaucrat for many, many years. And now as the founder of the Bhopal Literature Festival, I think he takes it forward with that same spirit of wanting to serve. I must thank the team of Bhopal Literature Festival for inviting us and for creating such a welcoming environment for all of us. And now, let me introduce this wonderful awarded, decorated author, Mr. Prasenjit K. Basu. You may know him as a finance whiz. He spent 25 years in Singapore. He began his journey in America. He went on to Japan. And today we are privileged to have him here with us. But while he may be a financial person professionally, an economist by virtue of all he's studied and practiced, his true passion is history. And his hidden passion is theater. So we are going to use his true passion and the hidden passion to communicate with you today. This book itself is not something you should rush through. It is, you know, I just had a candy square. It was in a huge box, beautifully packaged. I'm sure if I walked by the shop, I'd like to buy it because it was so nice and big. And when I ate it, I said, Bus. But this book is the kind of book you can not just read, but you can discuss, you can decipher, you can decode, and you can interpret. It begins with the fact that India is a civilization that has managed to continue through the centuries. There might have been a retreat, but that retreat doesn't mean that there was the end. There were other civilizations that had a conclusion. You take the Greeks, even Cleopatra was not, you take the Egyptians, even Cleopatra was not actually Egyptian, she was Macedonian. You take the Champas, where are they? Yeah? So there are several civilizations which are gone and done with. So Prasenjit begins his book in the 1700s and brings it to current times, right from the fact that our civilization is one that has had the staying power. And what does this resurgence mean? What does this journey mean of all these events that have happened? So it's very little time, 1 hour, 50 minutes, but we're going to attempt it. So Prasenjit, your first book probably reflected your journey itself because you went from the tea gardens, from studying in an Anglican school in Darjeeling to America, where you probably were thinking of the American dream, but not living it in reality. Those were tough times. So your book reflects how you started out from Asia, and you really know that very, very well, from Turkey to Japan, the industrial development. So tell us first a little bit about this award-winning first book that you had.
Well, the first book was, of course, about Asia, about the whole of Asia, and the modern economic and political history of the whole region. And the key thing that I focused on is why it is that the parts of Asia that were ruled by Japan are all the most prosperous parts of Asia now. So Taiwan was ruled by Japan for 50 years. Korea for 35 years, and the area that was known as Manchuria, northeastern China, was dominated by Japan for about 40 years. The whole of coastal China was ruled by Japan for about 14 years. But what is striking is that the most industrialized part of China is the northeast, and the only parts of China that are truly prosperous are the parts that Japan ruled. Taiwan was the most prosperous country in Asia apart from Japan in 1945, 1950, and still is. And Korea is next. So I explained why that is, and I don't want to take away from this book by going into too much detail on what that is. But I also pointed out in that book that the parts of Asia that were ruled by Britain the longest are the poorest parts of Asia. So so this book emerges partly from that theme, the fact that the parts of India that were ruled by Britain the longest is basically eastern India, including Bangladesh, coastal Andhra Pradesh and coastal Tamil Nadu. They were by far the poorest parts of India in 1950 and the poorest parts of India in the year 2000. Bihar is still the poorest state because of what Amitav Ghosh calls it being the heart of the narco state that Britain ran in India. But anyway, so this book, I begin by looking at what Shivani pointed out, which is that understanding why it is that our civilization survived through the millennia. It survived at least 5 millennia, while many of our contemporary civilizations from 5 millennia ago had fallen by the wayside entirely. So the contemporaries were Mesopotamia or Sumeria, Egypt, and as Shivani points out, even by the time of Cleopatra, we think of Antony and Cleopatra in Shakespeare, and Cleopatra was the queen of the Egyptians. But she wasn't Egyptian. She was a Ptolemaic successor, and therefore of Macedonian descent. So already by then, ancient Egypt had receded, and today, of course, Egypt speaks Arabic. The language, if you go to Egypt, the language is Arabic. The ancient Egyptian culture and civilization is entirely wiped out. Similarly, Persia. Persia was a Zoroastrian civilization, and the Zoroastrian civilization only survives in India.
With the Parsis.
And we have the great Tata and Godrej conglomerates as legatees of the ancient Zoroastrian civilization. In Persia itself, that civilization is dead. Although a version of the Persian language continues to be spoken there, quite different from the language of the Zend-Avesta, which was very close to Sanskrit, by the way. Now, apart from that, if you look at other, Champa, most of us probably don't know what Champa is. Champa is the civilization that dominated most of what is today Vietnam. From all of central and southern Vietnam was a Hindu civilization from 192 AD until 1462. And in 1462 they were defeated by the Zai Viet. So Viet comes from Zai Viet. And Vietnam comes from that. And then there was Angkor, just to the west of Champa was what is today Cambodia. And in fact, if you go to the royal palace in Cambodia, you'll be astonished that in the private worship area of the royal family, I found there was a Nandi. And on the walls of the royal palace are murals showing the Ramayana. And of course, in Angkor Wat, you find the Ramayana sculpted into the walls. So those civilizations have faded and been replaced by different ones. Oh, now we have theatre voice no longer required.
Absolutely. And even when we went into the time where there was a retreat and the Vijayanagar kingdom was no longer in control, you still had a third of the land and a fourth of the people who were sort of not.
So basically, my point in the book, in the early part of the book, is that like all civilizations, the Indic civilization has had its ups and downs. It's had serious downs as well. It has gone into significant retreat. So during the British period, for instance, we were supposedly ruled by the British for about 190 years. At least Eastern India was ruled for 190 years by the British. But even at the height, Britain is supposed to have conquered the whole of India by 1849. But while most of India was politically under British control, there was a third of India's land and a fourth of India's people, about a quarter of India's people, who remained under the princely states, who were actually treaty allies. Those princely states were treaty allies of the British. And 1857 was an expression of the Indian resistance to the idea.
Prasenjit, I'd just like to say one thing, that you know how other countries have controlled with conquest, but India was well established in the region through trade. So that's something that comes across very interestingly in your book.
Yeah. So the influence of India on Southeast Asia and actually even West Asia was entirely through trade and some sort of cultural osmosis rather than conquest. The only known time an Indian kingdom went conquering outside India, outside the Indian subcontinent, was the Cholas, Rajendra Chola.
They were invited when they went to Indonesia.
So Rajendra Chola, otherwise known as Gangai Konda Chola, because he had conquered, he had reached Varanasi and defeated the Pala dynasty in the north. And the Palas, of course, were a great Buddhist dynasty. After that, he was invited by the Cambodians, Angkor and Majapahit, the kingdom, the Hindu kingdom on Java, to rescue them from the kingdom of Srivijaya, which was a Buddhist kingdom that was imposing all kinds of tariffs, a la Donald Trump, making trade quite difficult in that region. So the Cholas were invited, and they conquered that entire region and basically subdued Srivijaya. But what is interesting is that the influence of the Cholas remained for at least another 500 years, because when Magellan arrived in the Philippines in 1520, he found that the Raja of the big island that he first arrived at, Cebu, the Raja of Cebu was a Chola. And the Raja of the neighboring island of the neighboring island of Mactan was also a Chola. And they were Hindu Cholas. And in fact, if you see the National Police Academy of the Philippines has a person wearing something like a dhoti, very similar to a dhoti. His name is Sri Lapu Lapu. And he is the one who killed Magellan, because Magellan converted the people of Cebu. The king of Cebu converted to Christianity, but the king of Mactan refused. He said, no, I'm not. If you want to convert me to your God, let's have a war. And he killed Magellan on Mactan Island. And even today, they celebrate Lapu Lapu. They don't know the language that he spoke, because the language of the Philippines then was written in a Brahmi script. The Brahmi script emerging either from Tamil Brahmi or Bengal Brahmi. And it reached all the way to the Philippines. In fact, there is some scholarly work that suggests that the Maori language of New Zealand has links to Sanskrit, and the Hawaiian language is also supposedly linked to Sanskrit. I mean, there's a very tenuous link. Hawaii is very far away from where we are. Interestingly, the last king of Hawaii was called Kalakaua. It doesn't mean black crow, but the name sounds almost Indian as well.
Well, when we speak of Kala Kaua, I'm reminded of Kala Pani, and that is also touched upon in your book quite extensively. When I look at you, I really understand what that term means, fountain of knowledge. Because sitting with Prasenjit, you can just go from country to country, continent to continent, topic to topic, and these dates come out like as if, he's a walking, talking encyclopedia. But Prasenjit, one of the things that you have mentioned in your book is, or rather focused upon, is the fact that the Indian independence, I mean, the way you've put it forth, is that it was not based on the non-violent movement. And it was really the nationalists / extremists and their very proactive functioning that really got us our independence. So, how does that weave through
So that
this
is
whole...
a very important part of the story and of the book. I'm not saying that Ahimsa had no role. No, absolutely not. Mahatma Gandhi had a huge role, and so I tell the story parallelly. So Mahatma Gandhi emerged in 1919 with non-cooperation and the Khilafat movement, and before that, of course, he went to Champaran and so on in Bihar. But the revolutionary part of India's freedom movement, I think, goes back all the way at least to the early 19th century, the Second Anglo-Maratha War, the Third Anglo-Maratha War, the two Anglo-Sikh wars, in the first of which Ranjit Singh's descendants, Sher Singh Attariwala in particular, defeated the British at a place called Chillianwala. And we don't know much about Chillianwala, but when the person was, the British general who was defeated at in Crimea, and the charge of the Light Brigade was considered one of the greatest disasters that the British Army ever faced. And he was asked about this being the greatest disaster of all time, and he said this was nothing to Chillianwala. And yet, Chillianwala is now forgotten in our history. That was 1848. But there's another war that the British fought called the Battle of Assaye during the Second Anglo-Maratha War. And the Battle of Assaye was won by the Duke of Wellington, who was later the victor at the Battle of Waterloo against Napoleon. And when he was asked about Waterloo being his greatest victory, he said, oh no, by far the greatest, most difficult battle I ever fought was Assaye. How many of us have even heard the name of the Battle of Assaye? So our history, we need to reclaim our history, because there are elements of our very modern history. I mean, this was only about 222 years ago, the Battle of Assaye. We know a lot about more ancient and more older parts of our history, but surely we should know that the British didn't just take India in a fit of absence of mind, as even William Dalrymple will claim, and a lot of British historians continue to claim. It was not a fit of absence of mind. It was great battles that they had to fight. Of course, a lot of subterfuge and bribery and so on was involved.
But ultimately, it was all financial, right?
Yeah, it was all
because
financial.
It was all for trade and
so Mir Jafar, for instance, Mir Jafar was bribed. In the Anglo-Maratha War, Assaye was an important battle, but just before that, the French custodian of Aligarh Fort, he was a Frenchman working as an employee of Mahatma Scindia. He had been bribed by the British for several years. He had been given East India Company stock. And so, when the battle was about to begin, he actually defected, because he had a stake, he had an actual financial stake in British victory. He had been bribed in advance. Now, the point is that it's pointless lamenting this, but we should be prepared in the future for things like this not to be repeated.
And also, I think just the magnitude of the kind of wealth that we had and was taken from us. In your book, you mention how at that time the the ruler of England, the four biggest landlords, their collective wealth was about 24 million. And the loot from Bengal alone was, well, loot,
So
disguised loot. You talked
Yeah.
about the prince, the
So
12.
when Mir Jafar emerged as so-called victor in the Battle of Plassey or Palashi, he then became the new Nawab of Bengal, with British help, and he gave a reward to the 16 members of the British Bengal Council. And the size of the reward at that time was 25 million pounds. 25 million pounds seems like a piddly amount in today's money. But in those days, it was
not
huge.
in 1757.
So this is 1757. And I did some research, and the total income of the King of England in 1757 and the 400 largest landowners in the whole of Britain, all of them collectively earned 24 million pounds in 1757. The British Bengal Council was given a reward from a single battle of 25 million pounds. So more than the entire income of the largest landlords, or basically almost all the income that was earned by the aristocracy of England that year. And that was just the beginning. So
And
I think
Prasenjit, your book very interestingly breaks up our independence into three different aspects. So if you'd like to tell us a little bit about how the cultural independence, the financial
Yeah.
independence, the political independence.
So now I'll give you 3 dates which will surprise you. So I say that we got our cultural independence on the 1st of November, 1858. We got our political independence on the 19th of February, 1946. And we got our economic independence in late July, around the 25th of July, 1991. The reason I talk about economic independence as having occurred that late is for the simple fact that through most of human history, India was the world's largest economy. In the year of Christ's birth, we accounted for 33.5% of world GDP. By the time, by 1500, we were still nearly 29% of world GDP. In 1750, we were still 24.4% of world GDP. By the time the British left India in 1947, we were down to 4.5% of world GDP. And by 1990, we were down to 3% of world GDP. So we continued, our share of world GDP continued to decline between 1947 and 1990. And it's only since then, since the reforms under P.V. Narasimha Rao, with Manmohan Singh as his finance minister, only since then have we really got economic independence, and only then, only since 1991, has our economic potential been fully unleashed. So now, to just go back to 1858, nice segue there. Why 1st November 1858? See, the story of the 1857 war has been told mainly by the British. And it's a total myth. The whole story is mythology. It's made to sound as if there was a Sepoy mutiny, and the Indian kings who participated were simply trying to restore an old feudal order which was dying anyway. This is hogwash. The real story. So I've put together the story by looking at a couple of books that were written from the Indian perspective. Very few. Even my book, Asia Reborn, I look at Asia from an Asian perspective. Most books written about India, books about India's participation in the Second World War, Srinath Raghavan, for instance, all the citations are British. So if you think of everything from a British point of view, you don't really get the real story, in my view. So
even 1857, the records were
1857 is
primarily all
completely,
English
so
accounts.
The one person who wrote a book early on was Veer Savarkar. Savarkar wrote a book called The Indian War of Independence, 1857. He wrote it in 1907. Exactly, it was supposed to be published on the 50th anniversary, on 11th May, 1907, but it was banned in India before it could be published, and it stayed banned until 1946. What is remarkable about Veer Savarkar, most people know Veer Savarkar as sort of the fountainhead of Hindutva, but in the war about the book about the 1857 war, he lambasts many Hindu kings who, including the Rana of Nepal, who supported the British, who defected to the British side at key points, like during the battle for Lucknow in March 1858. And then one person who comes in for very aggressive criticism from Savarkar is the Raja of Povan. The Raja of Povan betrayed Maulana Ahmadullah of Ayodhya, Faizabad, who was one of the great heroes of that 1857 war. And the Raja of Povan basically had invited him to talk about joining the Indian side, but when Ahmadullah arrived there, he was murdered by the Raja of Povan and his brother. And there is no doubt about who the villain is. It is the Hindu king of Povan who is the villain. So the point about 1857, of course, was that it was a genuine war led by, I was just telling Shivani the story
In
as
fact,
we were
that was
coming back
very
from Sanchi Stupa.
interesting. That is very interesting because we always think of the war of 1857 being something that the British navigated. But this book actually makes you think of the parallel story that was going on in India. What was the role of the Indian nationalists in that? So would you like to tell us more about that?
So the interesting thing here is, so I've looked at both the Veer Savarkar book and an even more interesting book that I'd highly recommend. It's called Operation Red Lotus. Is written by the descendants of Tatya Tope. They have family documents from that time that they delve into to demonstrate how the war was strategized and fought. Tatya Tope, of course, was the commander-in-chief of Nana Sahib's army. And about a year and a half before the start of the 1857 war, Nana Sahib sent one of his closest supporters, a man called Azimullah Khan, to Britain. He was sent to Britain. Supposedly, according to the British, he was sent to petition Queen Victoria about the treaty rights that Nana Sahib should have received, being the son of Baji Rao II, the last Peshwa. But it's evident that there was no lawyer by the name that was used by Azimullah Khan. So he didn't go to meet any lawyer, did not petition the Queen. He cut a sword through British society, but the leading journalist of Britain at the time met him in the Crimea when in 1856, and a few days later he saw him in Constantinople, what is now called Istanbul. So what Azimullah Khan had been sent to do was to find out the exact number of troops that the British had around the world that they could potentially deploy to India if there was to be an uprising in India. And he came back with a figure of 75,000. Having gone to Crimea, having gone all over the place, Constantinople, he said they have about 75,000 that they can redeploy to India.
The exact number that they
and that
actually
is exactly
deployed.
what they have. By late 1858, 75,000 British troops were in fact deployed to India. So we think of the fall of Delhi, last Mughal Dalrymple, 20th September 1857, being the end of the story. That was only the beginning. Lucknow fell to Tatya Tope on the 25th of November 1857. The previous day, Havelock, the genocidal maniac, died in Lucknow, supposedly of dysentery, but actually almost certainly he was killed in the defense of Lucknow. Now, I called Havelock a genocidal maniac. This is particularly, it goes close to my heart in some ways, because I was the captain of a house called Havelock House in my school. And little did I know, until I did the research, that the way Havelock and Neil fought 1857 in the Ganga, in the Gangetic Doab, was to basically massacre village after village. They would go to villages and massacre all. It was basically ethnic cleansing on a grand scale. Because the chapatis, you see, you've heard about the chapatis that were doing the rounds. What was the chapatis used for? The chapatis were actually used as a form of logistics. The chapatis did the rounds. They used to go from village to village. If the chokidar of a village wanted to join the war of 1857, they would keep one chapati and pass it on to the rest. If they did not want to join, they kept all the chapatis. So most of the chokidars passed the chapatis on. And then there was also some red lotuses that were being passed around to show how many soldiers could be mustered and how much logistical support was available. See, any war has to be fought by logistics. You need not just an army, but you need ways of feeding the army. You need ways of feeding the supporters of the army. And that is what was provided by the chapati, by the chapati system of communication. And once the British found out about it, they decided that every village needs to be wiped out. And so we had two islands until quite recently called Havelock and Neil in the Andamans. Thank goodness they now have different names. All the tourist brochures still say Havelock and Neil. It's a good way to get foreign tourists, but surely we should not have parts of the country named after genocidal maniacs. Anyway, so now what happened was that on the 30th and 31st of October, 1858, Tatya Tope's army crossed the Narmada. Now, the war of 1857, the troops, the British troops that had risen in rebellion were only from one of Britain's three armies. The East India Company had three armies in India. The Bengal Army, which stretched all the way to Punjab by then, but it was called the Bengal Army. Then there was a Bombay Army in Western India and a Madras Army in South India. The Madras and Bombay armies never joined the 1857 war. It was only the Bengal Army that had. And so what is interesting is that when Tatya Tope crossed the Narmada, he was heading towards Nagpur, Satara, and Solapur, which are the main bases of the old Maratha kings. So had he reached those places, the Bombay Army would have joined the rebellion. There would be a new front in the war. And
so your book very beautifully talks about how that was...
British troops would not have been able to do it.
Exactly, how they halted that with the Queen's intervention.
So they halted it by doing what? The proclamation, Queen Victoria. There was a proclamation made in the name of Queen Victoria on the 1st of November, 1858. And this proclamation did two or three things. First of all, she promised that Britain would never again interfere in the religions of India. So that's what I call cultural freedom. We got our cultural freedom that day. The other aspect of cultural freedom was that we were no longer to be ruled by a company. We were to be ruled on the legal basis of an empire. We became part of the British Empire, and the Queen Victoria, became the Empress of India. Kaiser-i-Hind, Kaiser, Caesar. India's Caesar. It's quite interesting because the German king was called Kaiser as well, and the king of the Russian Empire is ruled by a Tsar. Tsar is actually Russian for Caesar as well. Anyway, they all had the same pretensions. So Kaiser-i-Hind was the title that she took on, and that was, I think, a big improvement on being ruled by the company, because the company was completely rapacious. So, the rapaciousness of the company led to a famine in 1770, which killed 1/3 of the population of British Bengal. 1/3. It's almost unimaginable that the most prosperous part of the world, British Bengal was basically the part of the world that produced most of the textiles that the Europeans loved at the time. And within 13 years of the Battle of Plassey, 1/3 of the population of British Bengal died. Now,
and at the same time, you had the industrialization in Britain.
That started a little later.
Yes.
Around that same time, in 1760. But I'll come to that in a sec. But the really interesting thing about the 1770 situation is that when the revenue from Bengal collapsed, one of the consequences was that in the entire British Empire, you see, in those days, gold, the amount of gold you had determined the amount of money in circulation. So gold from India suddenly began to collapse in 1772 because 1/3 of the population was dead. There wasn't that much ability to pay tax. And so there was a recession, a severe depression in the British Empire, which led to the imposition of a tax on things like tea and other commodities. And the US, what then later became the US, the Americans revolted with the Boston Tea Party in 1773. The Boston Tea Party resulted from the famine in Bengal. Now, so these are the connections, the interconnections that most of us were never told about. But the other part of the story, of course, is that the person who was defeated by George Washington in 1781 at the Battle of Yorktown then became the Governor General of India, Cornwallis, and he introduced the so-called permanent settlement, which impoverished Bengal and what is British Bengal, which included Bihar and Orissa. So the point is that there were these interconnections. Now, the other theme is about what Shivani wanted me to segue into, which is that the Industrial Revolution in Britain started in 1760. Britain was the first country to industrialize in the modern sense. But the reason Britain was the first country to industrialize, in my view, is that when Britain arrived in India, they found the most industrialized country on earth. India was the most industrialized part of the world. And I say that India provided the clothes, India was the clothier to the world through most of history. We can go back all the way to Megasthenes, the grandfather of Ashoka, whose stupa I just saw this morning in Sanchi. When Chandragupta Maurya was ruling, he was visited by a Greek called Megasthenes. And Megasthenes marveled at a lot of what he found. He found a prosperous welfare state in India. But apart from that, he also marveled at the fact that the clothes that the Indians wore was so much better than the clothes anybody else had. And that, it goes all the way to 1708. In 1708, Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, he says, all our cloth, our bed linen, our carpets, our vests and underwear, they're all Indian stuffs. And this is 1708, but that was around the time. See, from 1610 to 1708, so about a century, the British were genuinely trading in India.
So just a question, which is that if when these people came and they were awestruck because India was so amazing, and then the whole narrative changed from being awestruck to wanting to possess and then wanting to control. So in a modern context, when you have a country that's doing well, and today everything's about projection, so if we project on that scale, what are the chances of a similar fate, or what was it that could be done differently that this whole episode would not have transpired in such a way? Is there a way to break the trend of be awestruck, then be, wanting to possess, and then conquer?
Well, I think you need strength, of course. The most important thing is you need military strength. And I think the fact that we have nuclear weapons makes it quite difficult to try any such stunts on us any longer. And we have ballistic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, that can reach almost anywhere on Earth. And therefore, that makes it almost impossible to subdue us in the same way now.
So
But that doesn't mean that new technologies will not emerge that will make nuclear weapons irrelevant. So, but at the moment, nuclear weapons are enough.
In your book, when you move towards the modern times and you really talk about all the wars that India fought for the British, and so many international wars were fought by Indian armies, so we were highly trained and very, very skilled. And yet when it came to our own borders, we needed a window of a week when Mountbatten went to England to attend the wedding, the royal wedding, Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth's wedding, for us to get a little bit of poonch. But when it came to Gilgit, it just went without so much as a little toe stuck in the middle. Yeah. So would you like to tell us about that whole fact that we had an amazing army and yet we couldn't help ourselves?
Yeah. So every war that the British fought east of Suez from 1838 to 1946. Note, I don't say 1945, 1946. Every war that the British fought was fought by the Indian Army. You know, when Hong Kong fell to the Japanese, it was the Punjab regiment. The Punjab regiment fought to the last man. There were 8,000 of them. All were killed. The British officers of the Punjab regiment had run away. But the soldiers kept fighting. So that's just Second World War. But, you know, in 1838, there were two British Indian armies fighting simultaneously. One in Afghanistan, it was called the Army of the Punjab, and one in China, enforcing, that was the so-called First Opium War, fought almost entirely by Indian troops. Of course, Indian troops under British command. In the First World War, they were all over in Mesopotamia, in the so-called liberation of Israel, what is now Israel, Palestine, as well as Jordan and Syria. It was Indian army, and in fact, in the Battle of Haifa, of course, which if you go to Delhi and go to the Teen Murti statue, the Teen Murtis represent the armies of Mysore, Jodhpur, and Hyderabad. Three Indian state armies. I was first struck by the fact that in the Battle of Haifa, there was an Indian colonel involved. There were no Indian colonels in the British Indian Army in the First World War. There were no Indian officers in the British Indian Army in the First World War. But there was a colonel. He was actually, he had just joined the Jodhpur army about 3 years earlier. And he was actually a major, but during war, he was temporarily promoted to colonel. And the entire army that liberated Haifa was Indians. There were Indian officers, Indian soldiers. And they were on horseback with lances. They had no guns. And they went through Haifa and liberated that place. It was the last great mounted charge ever successfully executed in war. Now, India had a great cavalry tradition. Of course, Bajirao I, there are lots of great stories about Bajirao I. I won't go into them, but they're in the book. And he was one of the greatest cavalry generals. Bajirao was fighting in the 1720 to 40 period. 124 years after he died, a man called William Tecumseh Sherman used Bajirao's tactics in the American Civil War. And this is referenced by Montgomery in his book about military strategy. So we don't know so much about our own history, or about great warriors that we had in particular, because, of course, Ahimsa is the story. Now, if I can just come back to that old story, which I didn't get to talk too much about just now. So Ahimsa had a really important role, but starting with 1858, you then had the revolutionary movement in response to the partition of Bengal. Bengal was partitioned by Curzon in October 1905, primarily to create a permanent fracture between Hindus and Muslims. Because Bengal was was of course the central province, the most important province of the British Empire, and the elite of Bengal were becoming rather uppity, and they were using the language of liberalism to hoist the British on their own petard. And that needed to be nipped in the bud, and so they partitioned Bengal. The idea was to create a deep division between Hindus and Muslims. Bengal at that time was 2/3 Hindu and 1/3 Muslim. When they created these two provinces, the eastern Bengal was immediately a Muslim majority province, and they introduced something called separate electorates. This is a really pernicious device, because a separate electorate means that only people of one community get to vote for MPs, MLAs, etc. within their community. So if you have a separate electorate like this, then you have no constituents who are outside your community or outside your religious community. And therefore you have no reason to ever think about the interests of anybody apart from your own community. That is the device used to deepen the fracture. There was very little of a fracture at that time. In 1857, no fracture, 1857, 58. They were intending to create a deep divide between Hindus and Muslims.
And your book talks about how just if a different area was considered, just a little bit more included, then they manipulated such that the Muslim majority would be there in Bengal.
So one of the things I point out is that the revolutionaries forced the rescinding or the repeal of the partition of Bengal. So partition of Bengal was repealed in 1911-12, and at the beginning of 1912, Delhi became the new capital. So they did two things. They punished Bengal by moving the capital from Calcutta to Delhi. That was kind of, and the second thing, but they sort of gave a reward saying, okay, we are repealing the partition, so now Bengal is going to be one again. The real trick, though, was that they drew the borders of Bengal in such a way, the new Bengal, new reunited Bengal, had 48.5% Muslims and 48% Hindus. The idea being that it would be a majority Muslim province, and therefore had to be partitioned in 1947. Now, the interesting thing is that after partition, after independence, the district of Purulia was moved from Bihar into Bengal, because it was almost entirely Bengali speaking. So had Purulia remained within the newly created Bengal, there would still be a preponderance of Hindus in that province, and there would be no need for partition. But the partition was a long-term strategy of the British. They always believed that if they have to leave a colony, they will leave it in tatters and divide it into as many pieces as possible. So Churchill wanted to have a Hindustan, a Pakistan, and a Princestan, at least, if not many Princestans. And at a minimum, they wanted to make sure that they had Balochistan and NWFP. Because all the oil, we often don't realize this, but the oil of Iran, all the oil in Iran was owned by one company called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, APOC, later called Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And all the oil in Iraq was also owned by a British-based company called the Iraqi Petroleum Company. So to protect the British control of oil in Iran and Iraq, they wanted to make sure that they have Pakistan, and particularly West Pakistan. East Pakistan was a little bonus that they had.
Well, just before we go, I can see a lot of movement here, which means we're probably running out of time, but I would like to very quickly touch upon the very important aspect of the title, which is India Reborn. So the rebirth, the ring of hope, the silver lining, if you touch upon that. And another very quick point that I want you to touch upon, and that is, what makes you Prasenjit Basu, who can write like this, who can be an encyclopedia on the move? So a little bit about your growing up and where you came from and why this happened. So I think we'd have to touch upon both very, very quickly.
Okay. So, I mean, I forget about my background. I'm more interested in the book than myself. But, you know, so now the book, with regard to India's rebirth, so there are three aspects to the rebirth, of course. The second aspect, you know, first is cultural freedom. 1st November 1858. Then 19th February 1946. Why? 19th February 1946 was the day on which British Prime Minister Attlee announced that he was sending a cabinet mission to negotiate India's independence. Never before had any British Prime Minister, any leader in Britain, ever talked about the independence of India. Now there's a widespread myth that the Labour Party had already promised independence in the 1945 manifesto. I would urge you to please access the Labour Party manifesto 1945. It's there online, and of course it is cited in the book. There is 1/5 of one sentence, not even a paragraph, 1/5 of one very long sentence, which says that we shall seek to advance India towards self-rule. 1/5 of a sentence. And this is almost the same language as was used by Montagu, the Secretary of State for India, on the 20th of August 1917. He had used almost the same language, saying we are going to assure India self-rule after the war. And instead we got the Rowlatt Act. So there's a big story there. How is it that we had a Rowlatt Act? The Rowlatt Act came in because the Ghadar movement had shaken the British Empire to its foundations during the First World War. We know nothing about the Ghadar movement. So Ghadar movement is very important. So was the revolutionaries fighting from 1905 to 1911 to rescind the partition of Bengal. And then 1946, you had the Royal Indian Navy mutiny inspired by the INA's war. The INA had demonstrated what Netaji said in Singapore when he arrived there on the 4th and 6th of July 1943. He said, I'm going to create a freedom army. It's going to be a small army, maybe 50 or 60,000 soldiers. It cannot defeat an army of 1.5 million, which is the British army of occupation in India. But it can show them that they are an army of occupation. Once they realize they are an army of occupation, they will revolt, and then the British will not be able to hold on to any longer. And that's exactly what happened. The Navy mutinied, the Air Force mutinied, the Madras and Jabalpur regiments of the Army mutinied in February 1946, and that is what resulted in the cabinet mission coming to negotiate India's independence for the first time.
So from Prasenjit's words gaining momentum and him speaking faster to put in more facts as quickly as he can, to my wonderful friends here in the audience who are nodding more and more and more, I think you're going to like this book. Prasenjit, thank you. Thank you for
so
writing all this, because these are facts that, these are stories that need to be told and shared and known. And you still held on to the secret on how you can spout all those dates, how you can know so much history, having a career which is in another field and running a tea estate. The
We would
mystery
like to know
continues.
that.
Run the TS.
I
My
agree
dad
with
did
you. We
most
would
of
like to know that because this was captivating completely. Yes, please. We have.
Yes.
Right? And they succeeded. What were the seeds of unity or disunity in India? How would you describe them or explain them, that we could not do something like that despite having powerful kingdoms, powerful rulers, huge brains, and essentially the resources of, of whatever there was? Was it complete impoverishment of ideas, or why did it take us another 100 years to, till 1857 to make the first sort of attempt to succeed? Did that story of American independence not come across to India?
No.
And so that's one, and because it's so interesting, and I hope my friends here will also appreciate my asking a question, perhaps on their behalf as well. if the British had not looted us the way they did, where would we have been and where would they have been?
Yeah,
So two different questions, but both I thought were relevant to the excellent discourse that you've made. I mean, it's absolutely amazing, praiseworthy, and it's a pity that, you know, we're not entirely packed, but I think it was a most astounding critique, and Shivani, you've done a fantastic review.
Thank you. Thanks, Shivani. So, with regard to why we didn't learn from 1776 and the success of the Americans. Well, first of all, the Americans, the population of the 13 states that revolted against Britain. Do you know what the population was in 1776? 1.5 million. So that was literally a colony of British people, of Anglophiles, who were, it was almost like a civil war. What we were up against was slightly different, and I think the well-known story of Indian history in that time is that the British were cleverer in making alliances. So I talked about the bribing of Mir Jafar and the bribing of Perron, the Frenchman who was custodian of Aligarh Fort under Mahatma Sindhya. But not just that, I mean, there were numerous others. There was a person called Raghoba, who was the brother of the Peshwa. And he was a tremendous warrior. He had defeated Ahmad Shah Abdali several times. But he felt that he was being sidelined. So for about 30 years, he was on the British payroll. And it was his son who became Bajirao II. And Bajirao II, so unfortunately, they were cleverer. I mean, the simple fact is that the British used our divisions very effectively. They aligned with Indian rulers. So for instance, after the Marathas began to weaken, Ranjit Singh emerged as the new great power. And if you think about Ranjit Singh's empire, it encompassed all of what is today Pakistan. Pakistan exists only because of Ranjit Singh, by the way. Because the Northwest Frontier Province was conquered by Ranjit Singh. Otherwise, it would have been part of Afghanistan, now called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So, and he also, of course, conquered what is today Jammu and Kashmir, and what is Punjab, Haryana in India. Now, but Ranjit Singh, when he was fighting his early wars, the Marathas and the Sikhs didn't get together. At the Third Battle of Panipat in 1761, the Marathas did not seek out the help of the Sikhs. And so there were these mistakes of the Indian side. I think we were complacent, partly because we were quite wealthy. We didn't think of these interlopers as being really the sort of danger that they were to our system and our civilization. And I think that is the best explanation. And of course, disunity is weakness. And we were too disunited through that time. Yes, I think there's a question here.
The second question, where would we be?
Where would we be? It's pointless. I mean, we would be a very prosperous country, and Britain wouldn't be worth anything. But what is interesting to me today, by the way, is that India has just signed an FTA with the UK in May this year. And what is intriguing is that India is, Indian companies, the Tatas, are the biggest employer in the United Kingdom for the last 10 years. The most expensive residence in the UK is owned by Lakshmi Mittal. And, others. I mean, we have very prominent Indian businessmen, including some crooks who make their residence in London. But the point of this is that we are increasingly playing the sort of role that the East India Company played, but not as a single company, but as several companies in the UK economy. And the UK is in retreat. I mean, ever since it left the European Union, it is in significant retreat. And for the UK, the FTA with India was one of the most important events of 2025. So I think the fact that the UK celebrates the fact that they are able to sign a free trade agreement with India is in some ways the empire fighting back, striking back. And it is, we are still a relatively poor country. Our per capita income is still low. But our share of world GDP is rising steadily. For 9 of the last 12 years, we have been the world's fastest growing economy. We will be this year, next year, and the year after. So we are now a well-run economy with a low current account deficit, low inflation, and the fastest growth in the world. That's a great place to be. The UK would love to trade more with us.
I think we have time for one last question.
I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can sit.
Good afternoon, sir. So, my question is, what was the reason behind the Battle of Asai?
Oh, okay. It was part of the Second Anglo-Maratha War. So, in the first, the interesting thing about the first Anglo-Maratha War was the main purpose of the Anglo-Maratha War, the first one, was to make Raghoba the Peshwa. And they failed. The British were defeated in 1782. So interestingly, around the time that the Americans got independence, the first Anglo-Maratha War ended with a victory for the Marathas, just as the first Anglo-Mysore War was a draw or a bit of perhaps a victory for Tipu Sultan. So it's not as if the Indians didn't have the wherewithal to fight back, but the second Anglo-Maratha War happened for the bizarre reason that Baji Rao II became Peshwa. Now, Baji Rao II was Raghoba's son. How did he become Peshwa? The previous Peshwa was a young man, very young. He was under the control of a council in Pune, led by Nana Fadnavis. And he felt very stifled. So he committed suicide as a very young man. And the next claimant to the Peshwaship was Baji Rao II, who was Raghoba's son. Terrible mistake. I mean, I think that they should have just ensured anybody but him becoming the Peshwa. So, since his father had been in the British employ for so long, he invited the British to set up a cantonment in Pune. Once the British set up a cantonment, that's the end of the story actually. In most cases, once the British set up a cantonment in your kingdom, you are no longer king, they are the king. So that's essentially what happened. So but after a few months, he realized he's surrounded by British troops and he's imprisoned. So then he began to try to revolt against this. And he instigated the Holkars and so on to rise up against the British, and as well as also Mahatma Sindhya, who was his greatest general. So Mahatma Sindhya led in the second, actually Mahatma was dead by then. It was his son Dalat Rao Sindhya who led the Gwalior forces in the Second Anglo-Maratha War. And one of those who fought in that war was a woman, Baijabai Shinde, who figures heavily in my book. Baijabai Shinde was a general who fought the Duke of Wellington in the Second Anglo-Maratha War. Later, she became India's biggest banker. And in 1838, she began to plan the War of 1857. She was the financier of the 1857 war. Nobody knows about her. There's a complicated story there. So,
Well, speaking of complicated stories, you just asked a question. What about that? What about that? There are so many whatabouts. And, even when you talk about Gwalior, Gwalior was supporting the British. And yet the most prominent freedom fighters come from that region. So how does that mathematics work?
so interesting. I mean, since she brought this up. 1857, Baijabai Shinde's great-grandson-in-law was the king of Gwalior at the time. He was a young man. So what she said to him was, that you stay on the British side because I have my banking empire to protect. So you stay on the British side, but we'll quietly ensure that the Gwalior army defects to the Indian side. And Tatya Tope basically took over the Gwalior army, and he fought. When Rani Lakshmibai had to escape from Jhansi, she arrived in Gwalior. So Rani Lakshmibai and Tatya Tope fought for the next few months using the Gwalior army.
You have to know this.
Which defected to the Indian side, and it was the trick that Baijabai Shinde pulled off. And interestingly, of course, she died in 1861, but her legacy, her banking empire, was then used to finance many of the Swadeshi enterprises of 1905 to 1910. And you have Scindia Steamship Company, was India's largest shipping company. It was directly owned by the Scindias. You had Scindia potteries, you had Scindia glass, and you had in Bengal many of the companies that emerged, like Duckback. Some of you who are a little bit older would have used Duckback as Macintoshes and gumboots, as we used to call them. Old technology now. Huh?
So
but anyway, so
as we are
Duckback was funded by the Gwalior billions, crores in those days.
As we're concluding, I'm just going to say, please note that Prasenjit said it was Baijabai's brilliance to say, you be there, send your army there, my banking continues. Then he spoke of Lakshmi Bai. So you all know the way forward, don't you? Where are all the girls in this room? Yeah. Okay.
So my next book is about Maratha women, heroines.
The perfect segue.
In looking through this story, I found that the role of women was so remarkable, especially in the Maratha Empire, that it's worth writing about. Tarabai, most of you, there's not even an Amar Chitrakatha about Tarabai, but she defeated Aurangzeb. So you don't even know about her enough to have an Amar Chitrakatha.
Well, you talked about unity being the answer. So amongst us women, we're going to have unity, and I'm going to hand over and
thank you.
unanimously conclude.
Yes, certainly, that's the way forward. But what a brilliant session. I think a huge round of applause. Throwing light on some hitherto unknown stories and the facts and research that find their way in this book. You need to buy this book now. I would request Mr. Raghav Chandra to come on the stage and felicitate the author, Mr. Basu, for his brilliant discourse, and Ms. Shivani Wazir Pasrich for doing such a fantastic job in facilitating this insightful session today. Mr. Chandra presenting the BLF memento to Mr. Prasenjit K. Basu and Ms. Shivani Wazir Pasrich. You must go to the Tribal Museum also, and there are plenty of places in Bhopal. Tribal Museum is one of its kind.